Hey everyone, this is the sig-auth meeting for October 23rd, 2024. Looks like we have a pretty light agenda. And let's see, Anish and I have the first bit, so we can walk through that. So Jordan slash David, I did promise you guys that I would talk about RBAC++ uh, before KubeCon. So I have some very rough slides and a little demo to talk about it. So let me just sort of start by walking through some of the user stories that I was trying to address with this whole API stuff. So um, the obvious one is stuff like what the node authorizer can kind of already do today now with the latest changes, which is like being able to list pods that are scheduled to it. Right, so that is already handled by node authorizer, but you can't express that today in a sort of a generic way. Uh, in a similar sense, right? If you have some custom resource with some field that matches the node name, how do you make it so that a node agent can only list the custom resource subset that match the node that is currently scheduled on? Those types of things. Maybe going further down, how can a controller only list secrets of a particular type? That would be also interesting, right? So that's another, field. That's a field selector on secrets. You could even go further and say, I want to be able to do like label selectors on secrets. And more interestingly, right, you wouldn't want necessarily just static control of this, right? What if you wanted to say, I only want you to be able to list secrets that are labeled with your username, right? So being able to reference attributes sort of across, right? Uh, so those are kind of the user stories I was thinking through about what I wanted to address. Um, Certainly during any of these changes, right, we want to consider backwards compatibility very strictly, right? We don't want any old API servers to ever get confused and start processing things in ways that is unexpected. Um, so the approach I came up with there was what I called conditional RBAC effectively. And what I mean by conditional is, in a sense, it's very similar to what exists today. It's just more dynamic. So you could say that a cluster role binding is conditional on the users that it can apply to. And a role binding is conditional on the intersection of both the users and the namespace that it lives in. Right. So those are sort of the two dimensions of conditionality that exist in RBAC today. You can scope it down to user, or you can scope it down to user and namespace. There's also within cluster role, and I think in role two is the name of the object. You can also kind of shove it in there. There's like a small handful of dimensions that we make available to you today. Um, and so the idea was to be able to look at more sort of dynamic dimensions. And within that, um, not everything necessarily made sense. Like for example, I couldn't necessarily come up with a scenario where you wouldn't know the verbs you wanted to allow ahead of time. I couldn't necessarily come up with that. That seemed a little out there. Maybe there's those cases exist, but I couldn't necessarily come up with them. And so basically, the design I went with was to leave cluster role alone, uh, and to also make the assumption that you don't need this level of fanciness if you're using role bindings. Basically, if you're scoped within a namespace already, I don't think I want to give you the ability to express random subsections of a namespace. Um, I don't know if that would follow under best practice anyway. I would probably tell people to just use separate namespaces instead of many, like a single one with like a bunch of slices inside of it somehow. So basically, that left us with one spot, which is basically a cluster role binding that is conditioned, right? So it's a different way of binding a cluster role at the cluster scope, but with a set of conditions that can scope it down, obviously, including like namespace. So that's kind of the gist of the idea there. And I can show um, an example of what all this stuff ends up kind of looking like. Uh, so I have a cluster role that says you can get and list secrets, right? And so then there's a new type called conditional cluster role binding. And it basically is here
Are
to
you sharing your screen? Because all we see is the slide.
he didn't it didn't change.
I see it.
I see it.
Oh, awesome. Just my lousy Zoom web client isn't changing. Never mind. Continue.
What if I like zoom in and out? Does it like refresh you?
No, it's a me problem. Continue.
Okay. Okay. Sorry. So where was I? So if I wanted to allow Bob the ability to list secrets, but they had to have this field selector, this is kind of how it would end up looking, right? Like, so you would have the cluster role. There's nothing new about cluster roles. Nothing has changed there. It's just in the binding, we would say the user has to be Bob. And oh, the other thing is, so I went with cell to do all the conditional expressions. One, because cell seems to be the way we're doing this stuff anyway. It ties nicely with validating admission policy. So all the schema choices for cell basically match exactly what we did in other places with cell. I'm pretty sure. So Anish implemented this part, Jordan, and I'm pretty sure he just straight up copy pasted code that you wrote. And I felt real sad because I was looking real forward to a challenge and felt real deflated because you had done all the work. uh, so, oh well. um, but yeah, so these two cell expressions, right? So they're ended like all of our other expressions. It basically says the user has to be Bob, and this is kind of ugly, but this is the way we express the field selector that it has to have the type equal set to my type, right? Um, but from there, right, you can get pretty expressive, right? So you could say that you can list secrets within a certain set of namespaces. Um, you can also do it by labels in the same way you can do it for field selectors. I think the more interesting one is maybe the node one, where you would say that, hey, the user has to be a node. So these first two expressions basically say, hey, you have the right prefix and you actually have something in the suffix and that you're in the system::nodes group, right? Those are the two checks we normally make for nodes. And then basically says that, hey, is the spec node name equal to the node name itself, right? So this is the sort of the exact expression that the node authorizer effectively implements in code, but this is just dynamically done through cell. Oh, sorry, David, I didn't see your hand. Go for it.
Yeah, so this is a clever way to reuse a cluster role binding, but I'm wondering if the person who's actually writing that, can you scroll back up to your cluster role binding? Like, our cluster role rather. So I'm imagining someone who is saying, hey, I wanted to find this cluster role. I suspect that when the person writes the role, they have in mind the selector constraints that they need. So rather than a generic, you can get list secrets or you can guess list watch pods, they probably know in advance, like, hey, I want a role that's going to let people field select when this is equal to their node name. And what they actually want to do in a binding is say, here's how you determine the node name. Or is there even a need for a binding at that level? Maybe there still is, but
So one of the open questions I had was, in the scenarios that we care about for such an API, would it make sense to just have both of these things kind of glued together into one API and you just express everything in one place? I don't know. I think that could work. I don't know if we're limiting ourselves in any particular dimension, so it might just be totally fine. Uh, I do I do think it gets very awkward if you try to basically put conditions in both sections. In particular, when you have a condition like this that wants to say that, hey, something about the user needs to match the request. So it's like you need like both things together in a weird way. Um,
It sort of feels like a parameterized cluster role or something.
yeah, maybe. But yeah, so to your question, David, I don't really have any strong opinions. I think either way could work. If we felt better about just having a, I don't know what you would call it, condition, like, I don't know what the resource name would be, because it would be both a binding and a cluster role.
Let's call it an awesome cluster role. Like, so if we had an awesome cluster role,
Sure.
and it defines something like you can get list watch pods where the node name equals the user extra and the node name assertion. And then we bound it with something like a cluster role binding to users in this group or to this user. Is that a more natural expression of what people want to do, where it's I have these things, they are subdivided, I want my cluster role to say you can get the ones that are associated with you.
I think in the role, saying you can select pods bound to your node makes sense, but how you figure out your node really depends on the user. So if it's a service account, it's coming from user extra. If it's a kubelet, it's coming from the username. And so like concept of like limited to the selector, but logically has like your node name being in the role, I think makes sense. But it's a little weird to split like the specifics of how you figure out the user's node name into the role and then bind it to users in the binding.
Yeah, that was the awkwardness I encountered, and that's why I just said I'll just leave cluster role alone. Maybe it's
but
easy.
this looks, well, okay. I mean, maybe it all looks weird, but this looks really weird to just have a cluster role that's
It looks like the role is over granting, and then you're constraining it in the binding, where you sort of want to see the shape, like what's the full shape of what I'm allowing in the role.
Yeah, I think if you want the full shape, you end up having to just have one object that has everything in it. Oh, sorry, not David. Winiak, you want to go?
Hey, is this also going to like somehow work for like updates? Like, what if I want to say like, hey, I want to allow an update on a pod, but only this particular field can be ever changed? Like, is that something you're hoping to support? Like, I know it's a made up weird scenario, and why would you ever do that? But like, just wondering like how powerful we hope this to be. Is it mostly like, hey, like for gets and lists based on field selectors is what you're envisioning, or would you see this being extended to something like, hey, like only if the update looks like this or patch looks like this, allow it, otherwise don't allow it?
Yeah, so I think for what I'm imagining for this change, I think I would say whatever you can do with this plus validating admission policy is sort of the limit of what we would support. So I think you can mostly express what you want through validating admission policy. You might not be able to do it in like the most ergonomic or clean way, but I do think you can mostly express that through the combination.
This isn't anticipating exposing the surface area of what the authorizer has, like the information, right? In terms of what is inside the object, which
right. Yeah. So this
you would need to like do admission decision in particular fields.
Right. So this does not propose changing subject access review in any way. And this does not propose giving RBAC or any internal authorizer access to data that a subject access review itself does not have. So it doesn't try to do that. Mostly because I would like a thing that lands in my lifetime, and not a thing that we argue about forever. uh, but in my not done slides, like way down somewhere, there's like this is in the way forward random, like there's probably going to be like stuff in these slides that basically says do not assume any of this will ever exist and do not hold me accountable for it ever existing. But I know, like, I think, Mike, I see you on the call. I know you've asked for like IP before, I think, because you're like, I would like to be able to constrict an IP. So I think if we want to have something like IP, we have to change subject access review, and we have to go through that whole process of creating that concept so that webhook authorizers can do it. Node authorizer, I don't know what node authorizer would do, but maybe it could do something with it. So those types of things have to happen. The more interesting ideas that I had that I don't think require changing SAR are like if you come up with a way to expose some of the API server state as self functions that expressions can then ask questions to, I think then you can get a lot of interesting things without needing to resort to a webhook authorizer, right? A webhook authorizer can have watches on all sorts of objects in the cluster and use that to make decisions, right? So, and it doesn't need any changes to SAR for it to do that, right? So it would be interesting if you could make decisions kind of like the node authorizer does based on the state of the world. All right, I don't know what that would look like. I didn't try to POC any of that, but those are some things that maybe in the future we might want to consider. And something like way more fanciful that I haven't really thought through is I dislike the whole over granting in authorization and then scoping and admission pattern that we have today. And it would be interesting if within subject access review itself, you didn't just have allow or deny or no opinion, that you could have allow, but with these conditions. And those conditions would effectively be your admission policy, right? So you would be encoding your entire policy in one spot. That's kind of like sort of the thought I had there, but those aren't well formed or even maybe practical in any reasonable time frame. But yeah, so I guess Anish, you have a host with me. I can stop sharing if you just wanted to show the demo real quick, and then
Yeah.
And we can ask some more questions afterwards.
Okay.
I can see your screen.
Perfect. So yeah, I have a test cluster that we built using the code that's there in the repo right now. And in terms of the conditional cluster role bindings in my cluster right now, I've deployed 3 of them, the ones that Mo basically shared. But quickly looking at the file, so we have this list secrets cluster role. And then the conditional cluster role bindings I've deployed is the one with the field selector. And then that basically mandates that the user is Bob, and then they can only list secrets of a particular type, which in this case is my type. And then the other one is based on label selectors. And then they can say, okay, I can list secrets in any namespace, but the secret needs to have this particular label, which is my value, my label. And then the third one that we can kind of see would be same user Bob, but basically having a regex on the namespaces that they can list secrets in. So anything that says prod hyphen, the user Bob can list secrets, but if they try to list it in any other namespaces, then they wouldn't be able to. Okay. Yeah, so this is like the first one, right? Like basically the user is trying to say like, hey, I want to list secrets of my type 1. And then it would get denied based on the cell expression evaluation. And then if they say, okay, I want to try my type, oh, crap. Okay. And if they say, I want to list it of the secrets that are of type my type, then it would say, okay, fine, it's all fine, you can do it. And then similarly, if we do the label selector, yeah, so they're trying to list all the secrets that have the label my label equal to my value, it would work fine, right? Like right now, I don't have any secrets, but it still allows the user to do it. But if they tried any other value, it wouldn't allow them. And then if they try without any selector and they say they want to do all, it wouldn't allow them to do that either because they haven't given us any specific condition they want to use. And then the third one is basically in terms of the namespaces that they can list in. So because we said they can list any secrets in prod hyphen namespace, they could basically say, okay, I can do prod 1, that's fine. I can list in production 2 namespace. But if they try anything in like other namespaces, it'll say you're not allowed to list it. And then like it does pattern matching. So in this one also, it would say no. The fourth one that we have, the YAML is the node one, but that's not something that I can show from with this one, but hopefully we'll have a actual component that uses that we can show later. But yeah, this is kind of the short demo that I had.
Thank you. I'll go back to sharing my screen. Any questions from anyone right now? Or comments or concerns? I lost Zoom now. Where did Zoom go?
Quick question. So if any condition matches, it will allow, even if the other conditions don't match, right? For example, the namespace one, you didn't put a field selector, but since it's matched the namespace one, it allowed it. Is that correct?
It's all conditions within a particular binding have to match for the match.
Oh, so that was a separate binding. It wasn't in the same binding.
That's right. Yeah, so it's ANDed together, not ORed together. So I was gonna scroll down to like, I'm trying to remember what the name. Is it like rules dot something? Yeah. Rita, go ahead.
I was just gonna say this would help with the enforce mountable secrets annotation feature, right? Like instead of doing that annotation, I could use this conditional binding.
Maybe I'm not sure.
Because then you can like check the condition on the like say use certain labels or whatever to be able to allow the mounting, right? Could you?
Not sure because the mounting happens through pod manifests, which aren't available to the auth layer. So maybe in routing and mission policy, you could do something like that, but I don't think you can do it through auth because auth doesn't have access to like request content.
Yeah, I don't think this quite helps that. Because that would be trying to keep out pods that mount secrets that aren't in some list or have some label. And admission, when a pod is coming in, doesn't have access to other objects like the service account or the secrets, or at least like validating admission policy doesn't have access to those other objects. David, can you read your comment out loud? I'm trying to parse it.
Oh, sure. So I was just thinking through like what sort of policies would I be wanting to describe, and one of them is like I've got a CNI, I have these 4 resource types. I want to describe a role that can read these 4 types, as long as the node name matches the node name derived from the user, and I want to bind that to a user or a group. But thinking about what I would be trying to inspect, I would want to say I've got these 4 types. You can read these slices of them. And then another case I was thinking of is if I didn't have a project API, but I want to be able to label my namespaces and let someone see certain namespaces that exist. I want to be able to describe something where it's you can list namespaces with this label combination, and then I want to bind that permission to a group of people. I don't think I would want to have instead a role that said you can list all namespaces, and then in the binding, I would be choosing a group and the label expression for it. Oh, I think that would be harder to inspect over time. But I mean, I guess a lot depends on whether you want to try to take this API forward or whether you just like, cool demo, look what's possible.
Yeah, so I guess David, so I think everything you said there is expressible in the system. So I don't think there's any concern about expressibility. I think you're talking about
How
like
easy is
understandability.
it to express, review, inspect?
Yeah, so is your preference that it's just like one object that contains everything, so at least you don't have to jump everywhere to try to find it? Like I mean,
I think I definitely want the two, right? Because like I can imagine like, hey, I have a way to list the namespaces that are on stage, and I want to grant that to sets of users, and I've got a bunch of
so
different ones.
So I do think no matter what, you have to have one place where you can access both the resource attributes and the user, because you need to be able to.
I don't think so. In the example of I have a role that says show me all the stage namespaces, I just need to bind to a group. The existing cluster role binding works perfectly. I just need a role that can express you can get list watch with label selector m equals stage.
Right. There's
some of those work.
There are
Not
some rules which you don't need user attribute.
Yeah, but I mean, I think finding an API that works for both would be nice, right? And
I mean, this rule right here, right? It's kind of hard to see, right? This one has to have one expression with both access to resource attributes and the user together.
yeah,
The condition is
I could make a different API. We could probably all look at it, and my API would say label selector m equals stage, and I bet most people would look and say, yeah, that's easier for me to read than.
Someone, I'm not sure who it was, said something about parameterized.
That was James Monroe.
Rule.
Mo, you're really just referencing that like you want an operator with like left hand, like a request on the left hand and an attribute on the right hand, right?
I guess
in that code snippet you showed.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess you could. Yeah, I'm trying to think in the example that David provided, where you would have I guess the field selector would be in the cluster role equivalent. If that was in there, how would I express in the cluster role that it was dependent on the user?
Sometimes you need that, and sometimes you don't, and figuring out how to make both of those tractable to create and look at, because tell and reason about it.
Okay.
I think
hold up. I see Bryson had his hand up for quite some time.
Yeah, sorry. This is my first sig-auth meeting, so I'm new to kind of the processes here. But I've been working on a project called OLM for the operator framework, and one of the things that we did recently is added support for like having to have a user specify a service account with like appropriate permissions to install something. And one of the things that we don't have guaranteed with that model, the current model of it, is like exactly what resources are going to be installed. So some of this kind of overlaps nicely with some of the perceived functionality of like RBAC that I would expect a cluster admin or something using that tooling to potentially want to use, where like maybe some of those resources that we apply for these extensions on a cluster might have like a generate name. So like you can't use the resource names today to like scope the permissions of OLM to only be able to like create that resource. So like some of this overlaps nicely, but I wanted to kind of echo like what my understanding of what David's trying to say is it seems like it'd be nice to have like some of those, like I want you to be able to do this thing in the cluster role. I wonder that like logically, I think that makes sense. Like from somebody saying like, I want to define what permissions something can do to be done in some sort of like a role place. I wonder, I'm not super familiar with like the internals of how the binding APIs work, but is there a way that you could like also, could you do both? Like, could you do like a new cluster role kind of thing and then do kind of like an extension of the role binding, or extend the current API service of like how you bind to a subject to also incorporate some of those things of like, I want special binding rules too, and maybe that's exactly what David's getting at. But I think from a like actually doing things from a cluster admin standpoint with how we've done things for operator lifecycle manager, it seems intuitive to have that cluster role defines those the things that I'm letting you do with any of those filters on what you can do on those things, and then the cluster role binding having that separate filtering for, and these are my particular binding rules.
Right. Okay. So maybe let me ask you, David, a question. Would it make it easier for you to understand an API like this if there was both a conditional cluster role and a conditional cluster role binding? Perhaps they could only link to each other, so they couldn't cross with the existing RBAC types. I don't know if that makes sense or not. And then in the conditional cluster role, perhaps you could only access the request attributes, which is kind of what's already in there today.
I think having a separate type would be a huge win, right? Because not crossing these streams seems valuable. I think there is a lot of value to be had by even just having fixed label or field selector values. I listed out a couple examples there, right? You got the namespace case, you have the ingress class case. Those don't require any substitution. On the substitution side, I think being able to say I have a role, a cluster, a conditional cluster role. I don't know that I like that name, but whatever. Conditional cluster role that requires these parameters be provided. Seems like it would let someone be able to pretty easily express, like, hey, this comes from the user. When you create a binding, this is what you have to provide. And here's how it's going to be used. Would make it easy to vet what the role is trying to say. So you can look at it and say, what are the goals of this role? And then also make it easy to know at execution time. You can't know at API validation time, but at execution time, you're able to look and say, are the different parameters that must be provided actually provided? And if they are not, failing closed. And so I think that helps idiot proof both sides to at least some degree.
Okay. So I think I follow what you're saying. Would you expect all the user / group and those types of constraints to be purely in the binding still, as they are?
Yes, I think so. But I think on the conditional cluster role, I would be able to indicate my name and my parameter. Maybe the name of my parameter is something that you clearly can only get from the user. And it wouldn't prevent doing foolish things, right? Like it wouldn't prevent doing things like the group of a user is used as a label to read certain namespaces. Like, okay, that would be possible, but it would at least be very clear you're supposed to provide the groups in here.
Okay. Yeah, so I think that sounds fine. Yeah, I don't necessarily know if the name makes sense, but I was just going with the name that came to my mind. Yeah, so when using the API correctly, you would end up having this awesome cluster role with a bunch of maybe a mixture of fixed rules with maybe a set of maybe parameterized rules. And then the binding would when they're glued together, if the binding needs to provide all the correct places to hook them all together, and also, I guess, constrained to the user or whatever. And if all those things work, then together you effectively have this very conditional RBAC expression that's pretty dynamic, but at the same time, if you only ever look at the role part of it, you still get a pretty good sense of what the system is trying to express.
Yes, I think you could also get a lot of mileage out of adding the user and groups to conditional cluster role binding, so that this set of user and groups are the only ones that are allowed to then evaluate these conditions.
You mean as fixed strings rather than expressions?
Yeah, and that would make
basically like hoisting the existing subjects in and then having conditions as well.
Yeah, because that way it would make it easier to do things like my kubelets derive their node names like this. and are bound to this particular awesome cluster role. And my service accounts determine it like this. And because I hate myself, I have an external OIDC that's providing yet another way to find a node name.
Okay. Yeah, so I think that's all tractable. Yeah, so I can take a shot at another iteration on this API to see if people like it better. David, did you mean to raise your hand?
I did, because I have another topic that I think will make you less happy. But I'll let James go first.
Okay, go for it, James.
No, I think what David there was saying about the parameterized thing is kind of what I was trying to allude to very briefly earlier. But you mentioned there about the username and groups as well. Do you see like extra info and things like that being in scope for stuff that you could parameterize on? Yeah. Okay. Cool.
Because you need that for service accounts, so there isn't really a choice.
Oh yeah, right. Of course. Yeah. Sweet.
So the thing that you might so a thought on this, right? I think this is a lot more versatile and will do more of what people expect if we extend the field and label selector restrictions to all the verbs. Have you like, so I'm sitting here saying, like, would that be a prereq to actually delivering this as a real feature? Certainly nothing for like the demo. Sure, by all means, demo is awesome. But in terms of like, if we were to consider a real API to come out of this, I think we'd want parity across all the verbs. And I think it is possible to build that and enforce it in the API server. And I think that greatly multiplies the value that you can get because it gives you one place to express using decently limited, so it's only field and label selectors, but it gives you one place to express. You can do both your reads and your writes and control them both.
So if I did a create with a field selector, I don't know, spec.node name set to foo, you're saying that the server would enforce that the object I created would match that field selector? Is that how that would work out?
Yes. And I believe it is possible to do. If you look, I think it'd be very similar to the preconditions that are evaluated on delete today. Similar, not identical, but they get passed all the way down to that lowest layer, and then they're evaluated just before we do the optimistic write.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's tractable. I don't know if I have an immediate thought on it. I mean, I don't know, it doesn't necessarily make me sad or anything, David. It's just more cube stuff.
That is something that I've got some use cases for as well, and well, was mentioned in the issue I opened the other day on field selectors in field selector set operations, and then you select a field.
Okay, so yeah, so I guess I'm getting two action items. One is to come up with a different shape of the API that makes it more obvious what's being granted and to whom. And I think on the binding part, we also wanted to have the subjects part as a way. I guess if you wanted to be really fancy and only use your expressions, you could bind to system::authenticated and then scope down using expressions if you wanted. I think that would be fine if someone really wanted to do that. So I think all that's tractable. I don't think that's too bad. But I have to think through all the. I guess the same thing would apply for labels too, right, David? So like if you update an object with a label selector, I assume, is it both old and new that would need to have the label?
I believe Jordan and I spec'd it out as both old and new.
Okay. It would certainly take forever to roll this out, but fine.
I'll say not forever, but you would certainly want to be sure everything failed closed.
Yeah. Okay. I think that's kind of fine. Wow, this took way longer than I thought it would. I guess I wanted to show a very quick little piece of the code, mostly because it was so simple. Because if anyone's familiar with the RBAC authorizer, when it comes time to like authorize a request, we just go over all the resources and check if one of them matches basically and gives you the right rule. So there's just one more of those. Now it was like, hey, if it's a resource request, list the conditional ones. Obviously, you wouldn't compile the expression in line, but that's what this does because it's a demo. But it's very simple, right? If the conditional one applies, then you check the rules and see if the rules allow the request. If so, you're good. Yeah. Certainly, this would get more complicated if you had a fancier parameterized matching something. I think you'd end up needing some kind of fancy index or something.
Yeah, I think we'd want the outermost loop to be similar in performance to the RBAC binding comparisons, like being able to do like just simple string username group comparisons as a first outermost thing, and then have the conditions be evaluated. Just so if you have 1,000 of these, only the ones that actually even possibly match the user group get into the conditional stuff. That would probably be good.
Yeah. There was one other thing I wanted to chat with you guys about. So RBAC today is a positive expression only system today, right? You can only describe allow lists effectively. If you just go with pure cell with no restrictions on what you can put in the cell, then you can start expressing deny lists, which isn't necessarily a good thing.
Not necessarily. Well, it depends on how you spec the outcome of this. If this can only answer allow or no opinion, then it can't deny.
That's not what I mean by deny list. What I mean is you could say you are allowed to get secrets in every namespace except cube system.
Nice.
That's what I mean. It is still an allow list, but expressed as an inversion. I don't know if that's a good thing to have possible. We can certainly parse the cell expression and prevent you from writing an expression of that type pretty easily. I have learned how to do this through the structured authentication config, so I'm well aware of how to parse an expression in that way and make it impossible for you to syntactically have a not anywhere in your expression. I just don't know if that's a restriction we would want to impose or if people would come after me for building them a system that did 99%.
Feels weirdly abusive. Like you're only allowed to use positive Boolean logic.
It is easy to implement. It would prevent
I don't know. I have to
The
think about
issue
that.
that we have with deny rules was that if they weren't all loaded, or if there was some sort of a availability problem.
Yeah, this isn't talking about deny. This is talking about star minus.
Yeah.
So basically, someone writes an awesome role that means one thing, and then we upgrade their cluster, and now it means another thing because they assumed secrets are the only core resources that I have access to.
As long as we don't provide any. I mean,
you can already do this with webhooks. You can write a webhook that implements star minus. I think star minus gets people into trouble, or they assume things that don't hold true in future releases. But yeah, I don't know.
Okay. This surprises me. I thought you guys would be like, yeah, totally, let's limit them. But if you're not, then I won't bother trying to put that anywhere.
Yeah, I don't think I would try to limit it. Maybe it'll become obvious to me why we must when reading it, but
okay. I mean, it's more code to implement. Oh, the other thing I wanted to bring up, and I see, James, that you have your hand, is this does not play very nicely with can I dash dash list because for obvious reasons, because the call doesn't.
Permission enumeration, I think, was probably a mistake. I regret doing it, so I don't really care about trying to enumerate for this.
What about privilege escalation prevention?
So the way I didn't bother implementing it in the POC, but the way the privilege escalation check would effectively work out is the permission that you were trying to grant, you would either have to have you would have to have it in a way such that when it ran through the authorization logic, you effectively had it unconditionally, or you had it in a way that your conditions did not restrict you from having it. And so the two inputs to that are the user and the namespace. And so if basically if your user had it in all namespaces, which is basically what would be required, then you would be able to grant it, but otherwise you wouldn't be able to grant it.
Like RBAC, we have covers checks. So we probably couldn't say this set of conditions covers that set of conditions. So we would just say you have to have it unconditionally.
Right.
Okay. That, as a first pass, that seems plausible.
Yeah. And you could also have it conditionally as long as those conditions were effectively not mitigating the thing that you were trying to grant. And that part is actually basically implemented in the POC, because I did update the rules for logic so that it could handle that. It would basically just emulate an unconditioned request and see, are you allowed to do this in that unconditioned way, right? Because you could have a cell expression that just said Jordan can do this, and that's the one expression. So that's totally fine because it didn't say anything about the request metadata. But in all intents and purposes, it basically means you have to have the permission via a cluster role binding already, or some other authorizer that just says you can do whatever you want, or an escalate check on RBAC. Sort of the same stuff that exists today. It's maybe not as neat and clean because the coverage check requires a very specific meaning to everything. But it's not so bad. James, did you have something else? I think you had your hand raised for some time.
No, I have my hand raised from earlier. No.
Okay. All right. Anything else on this, y'all, before we go back to the agenda? We still have like 8 minutes left. Okay, cool. Thank you for that discussion. All right. Guillermo, are you here?
Yep. Hey. No, yeah, nothing really to discuss here. I think this topic, you all discussed it with Micah like a few weeks ago. So ended up getting to write a small cap for it. Just wanted to put it in front of everyone. So whenever you have time, it will be awesome if you could take a look.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because code fees is rapidly approaching, I suspect most of us are kind of busy right now. But if this is something you want in 133, just make sure that there's reviewers and approvers lined up for it for that release, so that way it can get in. If it's a small cap, I'm sure it can make it.
Awesome. All right, thank you.
And whose topic is this one?
Oh, that's mine. Sorry, I forgot to put mine in front of it.
Okay. You want to describe what?
Yeah. So I was discussing this with Jordan before, that it'd be nice to have some sort of like node restriction-esque thing that you can apply to like service accounts that you run for like daemon sets, where it's pretty common to do something on the node and then apply like labels, but you only want to restrict them. You want to restrict them in similar ways that you restrict kubelet's credentials.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like, this is like an early proposal for how we could do that, and what it would look like, and how it would enforce it. So, yeah, just wanted to add it here and see what people's thoughts are on it.
Probably send it to the list too, for folks who didn't make it to the meeting, just to get more eyes on it.
Yeah.
Jordan or Winiak, do you all want to describe sort of a high level? I haven't had a chance to read this doc or anything, so I'm curious what you all were envisioning.
Sure.
Sure. Oh, go ahead.
So for the authorizer piece, this would be an opt-in. So on a particular service account, you would opt in the service account to saying, I want the service account to be node restricted. And at the authorization level, that would be a new deny authorizer, which when it saw a request from a service account like that, would kick off another authorization check for the same request, but as if it had come from that kubelet, to make sure that the service account isn't going to do anything that the kubelet on that node couldn't have done. So service account tries to do a thing, secondary authorization check gets kicked off to make sure that the kubelet on that node could do the same thing. If that passes, then this new authorizer is like, all right, well, the kubelet can do it. I'm just going to let the rest of the chain figure out if this service account can do it. So you still have to give the service account the permissions itself. If the kubelet couldn't do the thing, then it just hard denies and says, nope, your daemon set pod service account was trying to like update some random pod on some other node. The kubelet that you're on couldn't do it. No, hard no. So it's a strictly additive deny authorizer. So both the kubelet, the service account have to have permission to.
Okay. Your audio is cutting it out for me, Jordan.
Oh, let me try. Be off. Tell me if that's better. For things the kubelet can naturally do, like update pod status on its own pods, you don't have to do anything special. You would just give your daemon set pod status update, and then it would be able to update pod status for pods on its own node. If you want the daemon set to be able to do something else that the nodes couldn't normally do, like read a specific config map to get its own configuration, that's kind of, I mean, you'd probably just mount it in as a volume, but whatever. You would have to give the daemon set permission to read that thing, and you would have to give all nodes permission to read that thing in order for them to pass that secondary authorization check. So it sort of keeps you honest in terms of like, if it's not something the kubelets would normally be able to do, you actually have to give them permission to do it in order for node restricted to pass. So it more accurately reflects in your permission grants what is really happening. And then, so that's the authorization piece. That's the more tricky piece. It's a deny authorizer that double authorizes. The admission piece would just teach node restriction about these service accounts. And if one of these service accounts showed up, it's like, oh, you're a node restricted service account? Great, I'm going to restrict you exactly the same way I would restrict the kubelet. So that's the TLDR.
Okay. I think maybe it doesn't matter, but I think one of the questions I had in my head around how such a feature would be implemented is if it would be opt-in just on the service account, or if the node itself would have to opt in somehow.
Not sure what. I mean, like logically, if I were writing this, the service, I write my daemon set, I create a service account for it. I'm going to create a role and a role binding for it. And I just want to be able to express, I think at the service account level.
Though I guess how would you make this like upgrade safe, right? Because if an old API server doesn't understand this restriction, the service account will have broader permissions than you expect, right?
It depends on how you opt in the service account, I guess. we're kind of going back and forth on how to opt it in, annotation or field, or I don't know. Yeah, early sketch.
Okay.
You can figure out how to make the rollout safe once we figure out if there are fundamental issues with the approach.
Okay. I assume this would also cover like pod certificate stuff too, right? So you could have like ztunnel running on a kubelet, and that's a daemon set, and it would be able to then get certificates for the pods running on that kubelet, as it says.
This would enforce, so this would intersect permissions of the node and the service account. So you could grant things to a daemon set service account, and it would have to limit itself to whatever it was granted that the kubelet could also do. So whatever we're expanding surface area for in node authorizer for like pod certificates, and yeah, it would keep up with whatever node permissions got granted in the future.
Yeah, so you would end up, I think my only immediate concern with this design is you end up effectively like over granting an RBAC, because you know this deny authorizer will actually constrain that to the node. It's not necessarily immediately apparent that that's happening. Maybe that's okay because the deny authorizer is there, and I guess will be mostly guaranteed in the environment. I guess I don't know. Like I guess you always have to configure it somewhere in the auth chain somehow. Yeah. But
anyway,
overall, I like the idea because I think this has been a long-standing problem, and I'm glad someone to do something.
So maybe Vinay, send it out the list or the channel.
Sorry, you're cutting out.
I got what Jordan said. Jordan said, please send this out to the mailing list and the sig-auth.
We'll get more eyes on it and talk about it.
Yeah. Sure, will do.
Awesome. We are like 1 minute.
I'll make a quick plug. I am playing in the same space as Mo and playing with advanced authorization and condition stuff. And I'll have something to show for it hopefully next week, but I'll hit the list with it. So be on the lookout.
You can also demo it next week or in 2 weeks, Micah, if you want. That's totally cool.
Yeah, I would happy to do that.
Yeah, that sounds fun. I like demos. Demos are nice. All right, thank you, and we'll see you all in 2 weeks.